Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of October and there's so much to get into today. I'm going over the past 48 hours of events, but I am on a time crunch. And so this is going to be a very brief video, but it's going to be very comprehensive at the same time, beginning with the Yanchur River line and looking at Filia and Pokrovsk and Munirod being the central tenets of this video. We're going to look in depth at the developments over there. We're also going to discuss what's going on, of course, to the west of Zarikhin Torske, Yanchur, Novoselivka, that location. There's a lot of movement over there. In Kupyansk, as always, there are changes to the map and a lot of ambiguity that I would like to clarify. And then in Vovchansk, major changes that I've now been able to confirm. So let's just zoom in and get straight into this. You guys can see over here in yellow, these are the polygons indicating advances over the past 2 days. First and foremost, I want to turn on the fortification map so you guys get a clear understanding of how far away this is from the next line of defense to the east of Huliapoli. The Russians have advanced to the west of Malinivka and have taken over some of the final Ukrainian outcrops of resistance, capturing 1.8 square kilometers of territory. And this includes some tree lines and agricultural warehouses. So they've taken over these outskirts where there was some level of Ukrainian resistance up until even 3 or 4 days ago. In Poltavka, the claims from Deep State have now been substantiated based on Voin TV and their video released by the 57th Motor Rifle Brigade showing the capture of the entirety of Poltavka. So not only have the Russians been able to fully solidify control to the west of the river over here, but they took over the northern chunk of the village near Okhotniche. So now geolocations completely back that up. The Russians also took over this warehouse to the west of Poltavka. So any area that the Ukrainians could have used as a final standoff point to just really put a lot of pressure and ensure that the Russians couldn't expand westwards, all of those locations have been taken over. And there are no suitable fallback locations of any substantial kind besides just individual tree lines and open fields. You have to go westwards all the way to Vesele, and that's about 4 kilometers at a minimum, if not even more, from Poltavka before you can actually have a reasonable fallback location. Besides that, the Russians are now at the entrance to a new line of defenses, including this anti-tank ditch and fortifications, trenches that then will lead westwards to Novoselivka, and from there take a turn leftwards to Huliapoli itself. So the Russians are getting very close to storming those defenses from the eastern outskirts of that entire network. You can see that the advance amounted to 1.36 square kilometers. And in the post, the 57th Brigade, they captured Poltavka. They claim to have destroyed 5 Ukrainian armored vehicles, 20 units of automotive equipment, and more than 2 companies worth of personnel from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. Again, destroyed means it includes casualties, both killed and wounded, and the definition of company does vary depending on the size. And so this is a bit of a change because usually in these posts, the Russian side always claims 1 company worth of destroyed Ukrainian forces. And again, they never really give a specific number. And here they're saying 2. So the 110th Brigade did try to hold on over here, and they have now been pushed out of it. But that's not the only area where the 110th Brigade is operating. The 110th is also involved intimately in the fighting to the north, near Pavlivka, near Uspanivka, and near Novoselivka. So some Ukrainian sources actually are claiming that the Russians have crossed over the Yanchur River and taken over Novomykolaiivka in its entirety and are now having an opportunity. They have a linchpin across the river through which they're trying to assault Uspanivka from the east. That may be true, but I've not seen Russian sources talk about it just yet, and there isn't any footage of it as of now. The footage we do have is to the north of the river, and a lot of these excess Ukrainian territories that are turning into pockets and salients, you can see them over here. Just a massive chunk of territory to the west of the river, and there are no anchors over here. There are no major fortification nodes. There are no major villages, no major agricultural facilities. It's just 40 square kilometers worth of just pure open fields and tree lines. And the Russians are now trying to cut through this fluff and unify the flanks, the northern flank, the one that took over Privilia, and the southern flank where you have the anchor in Novoselivka. That's the goal right now. And using that, there will be a much larger perimeter through which to assault the northern parts of the Yanchur River line and all these other villages like Uspanivka, which is really the crown jewel at the moment. So what we see over here is that the Russians are making progress in this regard. They've captured what amounts to 3 square kilometers of territory. And there's a video here from the 110th Unmanned Systems Battalion, so they're drone units, and they struck Russian soldiers in trenches and in warehouses south of Novohrivka, which is now serving as a forward organization point. The Russians are aiming to take over all these open fields that are located on high elevation, high topography overlooking the river line, not just the actual crossings, but also Russian, Ukrainian-controlled villages on either end of the river. So that's currently the tactical objective. Let's see how that continues to develop. But let's move on. You can see over here that in Filia, there's been a slight change because now Deep State is finally acknowledging what we've been reporting for a week now about the Russian breakthrough past Filia and south of Novopavlivka. And as a part of their updates, they've indicated that all of the forested areas north of the Vovchansk River have fallen into Russian hands. So that's an addition of nearly 1 square kilometer. But that's an old advance. It's not really something that's currently new. What we're going to keep an eye out for is for the eventual closing of this pocket south of the Russian advance. And then we'll also look for the situation north of Dakhny, where you have some of the Ukrainians from the 46th Airborne Brigade and other units that are intimately involved in the defensive apparatus south of Pokrovsk. And they are trying to just cling on as long as possible in dugouts, in tree lines, not really in major trenches, except for this one over here, which is right now in the process of being flanked from the west and the east. And so all of this outstretched pocket is in really a lot of issues right now. It's in a quagmire. So those structural issues are eventually going to cause it to buckle in on itself. But to look at what's going on right now, the here and now, this is really interesting in Pokrovsk. I'll turn off the fortifications because they are slightly less important right now in the city. What's more important are the actual structures in the neighborhoods. So let's zoom in and see what's going on. So there is a lot of ambiguity because you have the Ukrainian maps that are not updated. You have the Russian maps from Radov and Divgen that are slightly different when it comes to where they believe the major Russian axis of attack is occurring from. So as a sort of average of everything, I've been looking through, and there are 3 main attack vectors that are consistently mentioned by numerous Russian sources. And again, this is also backed up based on the videos from the rail station in Pokrovsk. So there is backing for this. So I'll begin with the east, and then we'll go to the west. So over here, first of all, the Russians are in the process of clearing out the Shakhtarsky microdistrict. That is this district over here. It includes numerous high-rise apartment buildings, serving like a citadel-esque sort of fortification system because there are really hardened and really strong concrete slabs that are holding up those apartments. And then you also have the basements for concentration of forces. So the Russians have not been able to take it over in its entirety. And the same thing would apply to the Sonyachny district to the east over here. Those locations are still under partial Ukrainian control. But the Russians did take over the Lazorny microdistrict, which is over here, and are using that as a linchpin, as a first forward point through which they can dispatch forces. First of all, to take over the garages over here, which is what they did. They took over dachas slightly to the west, and they've used that as a path, and they're paving now this advance along this road. I don't know its name, but you could see over here how it's sort of pushing northeastwards, and they've been able to arrive at the Defenders of Ukraine Street on the E50 highway, really important road that serves as the connecting point between the northwestern and the southeastern parts of Pokrovsk. So this location has been taken over, and in the process, a lot of these apartment blocks have been taken over, and they're sort of in this limbo state in between the microdistrict over here, and then you also have Pivdeny microdistrict, which is the microdistrict a bit to the northwest of the Shakhtarsky one. So in that location, there is a Russian exploitation. The Russians have exploited a weak point in the Ukrainian line where there's slightly less resistance and it's not as well defended. So the Russians are now really tapping into this, and it's a very narrow route, albeit one that they are not being pushed out of. They simply can't. The Ukrainians are completely in defensive mode, and there are some Ukrainian DRGs actually trying to conduct ambushes, but that's about it. Now you have the Russian forces crossing over Defenders of Ukraine Street and advancing at least another 400, 500 meters. And this is already really important because they're arriving at the areas of the city that are suddenly more open. There are bushes over here. There are plots of land out in the open. You have just houses that are 1 story high. They're very easy to take over once you have a force that seeps into it, and then they can occupy the basements. And then from there, it's actually difficult to dislodge. So this is a location where there's a lot of ambiguity. There's not really solid control. What I would say is that the Ukrainians likely do have some stronger control in the easternmost parts of Pokrovsk, simply because even though it's difficult to arrive at those locations, the Russians have not made the effort to infiltrate into them yet. So this area, and you guys have to remember, there's the Sobachovka and the Pervomaika microdistricts. So this is the Sobachovka microdistrict. It's the easternmost parts of the town. And then from there, you have this main road, this main vertical road, Vulitsia Shosena, over here. And to its east, you already have the small cooperative villages and towns that are not really a part of the city itself, but they're still attached to it. So Ri and Nadivka. So those areas as well are still under solid Ukrainian control. But the supply lines into it are very, very thin. That's a big problem right now for the Ukrainians because they're getting disconnected. They're not really able to send in replenishments. And we'll get in a moment into the supply situation because it is really, really difficult. But the main point that I'm trying to really hone in on over here is that the Russians have been able to pave this route. They're going to try to expand it now, trying to really broaden the flanks. So they've captured at least 0.85 square kilometers. The goal is going to be to take over all of the apartment complexes, and then from there, use it as the staging ground for larger groups of Russian forces to cross over, take over all of the Sobochovka microdistrict. And it's an area that the Ukrainians simply don't have the coverage for to actually man every single individual house. The Ukrainians don't have the manpower near ground zero, and even if they did have the manpower over here, it would not be safe. It would simply be way too dense. And at a point in time where Russian drone coverage is really ubiquitous in this area, at least, we'll talk about other locations, but at least over here near ground zero, it is ubiquitous. And where fabs are becoming more heavily integrated, it's simply not something that's feasible, especially with supply lines, which again is another matter. You can see over here that there is this massive rectangle-shaped district. So some Russian sources claim that all of it is under their control, but I would need to see more proof of that in order to actually change the map. But it is certainly a gray zone. The Ukrainians are not able to hold on to all the houses over here. So what's going on is that previously Russian DRGs or even just forward assault forces would be sent in with groups of 2 to 3. Now the groups are expanding. It's more than that. And they are starting to become the vanguard. They're starting to actually physically get control over houses and then bring in more people to join in on the assault. So one route appears to be through here as well, along Vulitsia Samarska. You can see that road over here. And it's important because as they approach along this direct route from the south, they're going to get very close to the rail station and to all of the denser parts of Pokrovsk that are next to it. Vulitsia Centralna is over here. You have the main garden, the main park in the city. So we'll actually demarcate the districts because that is important to note that you have Sobochovka over here, for instance. Let's just use this as the marking for it in the dotted red lines. You have the market district. The market district is this location over here. You have central district. Central district, I think, is this location. But again, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. And maybe it includes this entire rectangular section where you have the condos and the duplexes and such. So those are the districts right now that are under the most intense fire. There's the central district includes the local hospital, and it's also, connected to where you have the main church and the main park and everything like that. And the border region, really separating Pokrovsk into two, bifurcating it, so to speak, would be the rail station because it is such an open area and it would be difficult to move past it from one place to another without being exposed to the aerial reconnaissance. Another area where the Russians are turning the tide would be over here near Vulitsia Privolna. So there was a video actually of a Russian soldier getting ambushed by 2 Ukrainians in Lyman, and that was actually released on October 18th. It could be older, which is why I'm not going to change the map based on it, but it does show that even up until very recently, up until 2 days ago, there were some Ukrainian forces that were able to slip through the cracks and push through Vulitsia Privolna all the way down to the sort of major Russian garrison, which is forwardly deployed. When you look at the forward deployment point for some of the battalions, it's around here now. And from there, they're getting dispatched in smaller groups. But they organize in Leotovici. So there was apparently a group of 2 that were able to infiltrate and ambush a Russian soldier. But since then, the situation has changed. The Russians have been able to push further to the northeast. They've taken over control of almost all of the forested areas in between the southwestern part of Pokrovsk and then the areas near Pivdine. And the Jubilee Park is currently in a gray zone, but the Russians are making an effort to clear it up. And then from there, they'll have control of everything south of the E50 highway, and it can't be used at all. Even though right now it's definitely not being used because it's been infiltrated along 2 major points. So the Russians captured at least 0.65 square kilometers, and they're advancing into the market district. The market district being over here where you have the home goods store, you have a lot of major warehouses, industrial facilities, major stores, retail chains, furniture stores and such. And then you also have just private residential areas. So those are all being stormed right now by the Russians. They are in a gray zone, and there are pockets that are just completely inconsistent. You have locations that are deeper into the city that are under some Russian pressure, and then you have areas to the south where you have Ukrainians holding out. And so it's just really all over the place, and that's a bad situation for the Ukrainians because they are on the back foot, and if they don't stabilize, then eventually that ambiguity will, the entire zone, the entire corridor where you have a gray zone will eventually be actualized as a Russian-controlled zone, and there will be no turning back from that point. And the Ukrainians so far have not shown any indications that they're even trying to stabilize with the reinforcements coming in externally. They've not really been deployed. There aren't many more reinforcements to bring in over here after the reinforcements that were sent in to double down on the city in August, which we'll get to in many other videos. The Ukrainians, on their part, are defending with the 68th Aegir Brigade, 25th Airborne Brigade, 155th Mechanized Brigade. You have 92nd Anti-Tank Battalion, Special Police Regiment, Kiev over here, one of the battalions of the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, 2nd Battalion of 152nd Jaeger Brigade. These two units pretty much defending the western approaches, which we'll talk about now. So to zoom in, almost all of Dorniak microdistrict has been taken over by the Russians. The main reason why the Russians broke through in Pokrovsk is because they took this route to the west. They understood that attacking Kherson was not feasible at certain points due to the rigidity of the Ukrainian line. Now it's very porous, but that's only a consequence of the western flank collapsing first. The Russians were able to storm Dorniak, and then from there took over the northern part of the microdistrict. From here, they seeped into these windbreaks near the rail line. And along that route and along some of the adjacent houses just to the south, like around Prokofiev Street, they advanced all the way to the central rail station. You can see that over here. The rail station is pretty much around this location. It's one of the widest parts of the rail station, and there are adjacent houses as well that were occupied by the Russians. And they were able to surprise and ambush a lot of Ukrainian forces, kill 5 of them in one clip, and then get the other 2 to surrender. Drone crews helping them out in the process. And they were able to just isolate, encircle Ukrainian forces in basements and cellars, in houses in this region. And so now they're engaged in firefights, close quarters battles with the Ukrainian forces that are just trying to hold on to every single square inch of territory. The problem is this western flank is now so deep and so strong that there is an opportunity to unify with the Russian forces advancing through the market district near Volitsia, Shevchenko over here, meaning that all of the Ukrainian forces located over here, they are either solidly in control of these houses or they're in a gray zone, but either way, this location that I'm just going over with the shape over here, you could see that it's in grave danger. And this is within the Pervermaika microdistrict, which is one of the westernmost locations in the city of Pokrovsk. But this location, again, is also an area where you have a lot of shrubbery, a lot of open areas, a lot of these uniform roads and just private residential areas, not many apartments at all. So it's an area that's also very easy for the Russians to just completely infiltrate and undermine from within. So you look at the central district. This is an area where you have some of the strongest Ukrainian control south of the rail line because it is just so close to the northern part of Pokrovsk. And you do have a couple of larger buildings over here, larger structures. But then again, everything is really beginning to close in on it. So that's the direction in which things are heading. But to look at the northern part of Pokrovsk, that's where you're seeing a lot of the Ukrainian units currently operating. Drone crews that may be fighting over here are stationed in that location. But even they are in a lot of dire straits right now because the E50 highway into the city has turned into a gray zone. So the western approaches are now not even solidly under Ukrainian control. The 8th district of Pokrovsk, which is this location over here, it's still largely under Ukrainian control, but DRGs are making their first sort of forays into this area, trying to undermine it already and trying to already cause issues from the rear for the Ukrainians as they try to find a way to stabilize the situation. So that's pretty much what's going on in Pokrovsk. I would talk about it for way longer, but I just can't. I'm going to speed through the rest of this. Mirorod, we can see the Russians took over 12 square kilometers of territory west of the city. So Kozatsk has fallen, Balakhan's fallen. The Russians are now in the southern parts of the city. The 38th Marine Brigade dropped major explosives, high-yield explosives, onto houses in Mirorod, west of Kozatsk. And this is a video from October 18th backing that up. And that's the first confirmation of the fact that the Russians are now actually seeping into here. And they're going to use this as the first base through which to expand along Volitsia, Sirova, or Volitsia, Stritsenka, and then from there actually arrive at the larger portions of southern Mirorod, because this area is really along the edges, but there's a lot of just surface area that can be taken over. And it's very similar in layout to those locations in southern Pokrovsk that we talked about, with the gardens, with just the one-story houses. But there are a couple of locations like this major Terracon, an industrial facility in the southeastern corner of the city, that are slightly more difficult to overrun, but they may just naturally fall just due to the fact that the Russians are bypassing them. The Russians have bypassed a lot of major Ukrainian holdout points. For instance, over here to the east of the city, they simply bypassed it by advancing through the towns like Kozatsk and Balkan. And then the Ukrainians were at a point where they were so outstretched and the threat of getting cut off was so high that they withdrew on their own. And the same thing is probably going to happen now with Permin, because Permin is also now in an outstretched location about 2.5 kilometers away from what would be a more stable line. So the Russians are also beginning to take advantage of the gaps in the Ukrainian line over here, because there's simply not enough manpower to hold on to all of Pokrovsk, every single house in it, and then also every single part of the outskirts of Murorod. So that's why we're seeing things starting to buckle up over here. And the same thing goes for the northern outskirts of Murorod that we talked about in the last video. The fact that the Kapitolina mine is beginning to fully fall, that's what some Russian sources are saying. So this area over here, and also the Centralna mine, that's not confirmed yet, but it is something being mentioned by Russian sources. And just one last thing I forgot to mention is that we have the video over here from October 19th of 4 Ukrainian civilian residents that were killed around the train station. And the video was released by a Ukrainian Mavic drone. They filmed it, and they're claiming that the Russians were responsible. Now, if that is actually true, then, the Russians are using AK-74s or maybe 12s or something of the sort, but the distance would be between 300 and 600 meters away. That would be the sort of firing range when you think about it. And that basically backs up the location that we were talking about to the west of the geolocated point where that happened. And so it could be perhaps 800 meters away from where the gray zone is, or perhaps even less, which is why I think that my map is actually an underestimation of where the Ukrainians are truly stationed at this point. I'm just trying to be very, very conservative without seeing footage. And then once we see it, that proves otherwise. But it does indicate to us that there is a Russian presence over here, and that it is undermining the sort of rear points, and rear within the context of the city of Pokrovsk, those rear points that used to be far more comfortable and were actually undermined in a similar fashion in August. But then at the time, there were actually reinforcements coming in to change the situation. Now, the thing is, the fog in Pokrovsk has made the Ukrainian movement of forces in and out slightly easier, so that's been beneficial to them. The problem is that the pockets has constricted when it comes to the distance. It's only about like 8.4 kilometers now, and there aren't many main roads that are available besides the one from Hrychny. That's the main one that's currently being relied on, and then from there you leave to Murorod or Pokrovsk. Either way, it's very difficult right now. Russian drone dominance is far more present within the pockets, not as much outside, even though it is still a big issue. But the Ukrainians are very rarely and seldom using wheeled vehicles at this point. Only when there is a favorable weather condition, or when it's nighttime, or when they switch routes randomly. That's the only way it could happen. For the most part, the Ukrainians, for 20 kilometers, they're walking on foot to get in and out of this entire pocket, and they're holding many kilograms worth of gear on them as they do that. And so it's just a very difficult logistical bottleneck at this point, and that's one of the main reasons why the Russians are seeing so much success now. It's just been building up over a long time, and it leads to a point where there's forces attrited over there that can't really put up the same amount of gumption as they could have a couple of months ago. I want to look very quickly at what's going on in Torske, because my map is, again, very conservative. The Russian forces have captured everything south of Torske, all of the sort of pond areas and the low-lying floodplains near the Zherebets River, so about 3.16 square kilometers. Yanchur still contested, not much of a change over there. The Ukrainians know that losing it would then give the Russian DRGs, free reign to enter into Lyman, but that's already happening even without Yanchur. The Russian forces have expanded past the Hrychny. By now, I should just change the map and show that all of it's under Russian control. That's not really a question anymore, but what is in question is the fact that there may be DRGs pushing directly west of it. So there has been an advance recorded near this tree line in particular, meaning that the Russians are, let's measure it. Let's see how far away they are from Lyman. They're only about 6.5 kilometers away from that point, directly to the east. And then to the southeast, DRGs are making an effort to push through the forested areas where we see this yellow polygon in that advance. So they're trying to capitalize on that. Some claim that they've been able to cross over Vlitsia, Klivernal already, and from there just take advantage of all the foliage and the dense trees, and from there reach the outskirts of Lyman and begin the harassment campaign. Something that we talked about months ago during the summer or even before. We talked about the possibility of that happening. Now we're beginning to see the first stages of that. Now that's coming in tandem with the advances over here to the north of Zarichny. So Mirny's been taken over in its entirety, the village of Mirny. We can see a geolocation over here from October 16th of the FADEM unit of the 60th Brigade of FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers west of Mirny. So this area where you had an outstretched Ukrainian pockets with the goal of just directing attention away from Lyman. It's been taken over now. The front line is getting more constricted as the Russians get very close to Volitsia Zhivotna in its entirety. And from there, they are going to overrun some of the major fortifications that are meant to absorb attacks before you arrive at Lyman itself. So you have the line over here near the road, and then you have one other line that is also based around a couple of these ravines. And then from there, you have the outskirts. And the outskirts themselves aren't necessarily the most well defended. So by that point, it's going to be way more difficult to absorb the attacks. So a lot of this large fluff area, these excess fields are beginning to close in on themselves due to the momentum of the Russians really beginning to build up, and the Ukrainians no longer being able to hold on to territory with a small group of forces. It's not feasible in certain locations. And again, Novoselivka, another location that's now under intense assault. Some Russian sources claim that it's largely been taken over by them. Like this, they claim the eastern part has been taken over. Again, not confirmed, but it is true that the Russians advanced past Andrikholove, captured 5 square kilometers, advanced, I suppose, 3.6 kilometers southwards, got into the first forests north of the village, and they're using that as a staging ground to actually infiltrate into the village. So they've been able to flank it, not just from the east where you have Derilove, which has not been taken over yet, but also from the north. And so really from all directions, the village is being closed in on. If it's not been taken over already, the groundwork has already been laid for that potential capture. And after that point, you look at it, and the supply route into Lyman is very narrow. It's only about 4 kilometers, and it's only running through Yarova and then Drobysheve. And so, again, the northwestern flank is also an area that's very concerning because it's not the most fortified. It's not fully fortified. Really, the only advantage is the fact that the resistance and the fact that you have a couple of villages that have to be fought over first. But those are currently in the process of being targeted and being stormed by the Russian side. So I'm going to change Novoselivka to a contested status right now. Now, let's finish off with Vovchansk and Kupyansk quickly. Kupyansk, not anything major going on over here. Some Russian sources claim that they've been able to, further consolidate in the central and southern parts of the Kupyansk. So in this area where I'm marking with red, especially near the school, the major school in southern Kupyansk, but there's no confirmation yet. There's a video from October 18th of a Ukrainian counterattack that occurred near the Jubilee district where you have all the apartments. So there was a fiber optic FPV strike, actually multiple of them, on a Ukrainian T-64 as it was trying to come in and suppress the advancing Russian assault squads. And they were accompanied by some Ukrainian pickup trucks that were transporting infantry, and they were targeted not only with drones, but also on the ground with these thermobaric man-pads, or not man-pads, but man-launched RPGs. So that's about it for Kupyansk. And then we can see over here that to the north where you have this major Russian infiltration that's going on in Kharkiv. You can see that the Russians advanced under the 3.26 square kilometers. This is from October 18th. The 3rd Battalion of 22nd Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes on forested areas in dugouts where Russian forces were advancing near Ambarny. And they're very close to it. It's very disconnected from other Ukrainian villages nearby. It's an area that's outstretched. Horrible logistics when you think about it. Very easy for troops, Russian DRGs, to sort of seep into the forested areas that are not really under any intense shelling right now. The foliage is almost completely intact. Shelling has not really done its course on it. So there are really a lot of hiding spots and a lot of dugouts to be taken advantage of. And Ambarny has now been put in this very difficult situation where it's flanked from the east and the north. So something to keep an eye out for, definitely. And then Vovchansk to finish off. You can see over here that there are major changes that have occurred over months, not just over the past day. So I don't want people to mistake this for just one sudden breakthrough. Look at this. In Tikhe, the Russians took it all over. It's to the north of the river over here. You have the major dividing line running along the river over here. But Tikhe, this really important village north of Vovcha, has been taken over. And then over here within the northern parts of Vovchansk, you have another major advance. So the Central Park, the major industrial zone that was fought over for months in 2024, all these other high-rises near Hoholia streets, near Zonova streets, and then the private residential areas near the river have been taken over. You have, of course, the cemetery and a couple of large plots of land that were in a gray zone for a while taken over. So all these locations that were major fluff, the Ukrainians held on for so long in these locations when you think about it, because it started in May 2024 and now we're in October 2025, and only now is this sort of 25% of the city being taken over fully, and the dividing line is once again naturally falling to the river itself. That's the new dividing line, but the Russians have already infiltrated it to the west. So first of all, this downtown part of Vovchansk has been taken over, where you have a lot of major hospitals, a lot of apartment buildings, you have a local school, so all those locations have been taken over recently. And then in the western part of Vovchansk that is more open, it's less dense when you think about it, the Russians have also been able to capitalize, both from the factories, the industrial zone over here. That's one location they advanced through, and also near the rail line, because you have Zalizhnishna streets advancing directly to the south. But also from the forested areas, they've been able to use DRGs to sort of clear it out, and then from there exploit with ground forces, actual accumulation points being set up in this area. So Lezi, Ukrainka streets, Kislyakivska streets, all those locations have been taken over now. And that means the Russians already have a solid point through which to begin the next stage of attacks towards the southern outskirts of Vovchansk, because there's still a lot of work to do when you think about it. There's still major warehouses, major industrial zones, not really apartments or anything like that, but there are still a lot of houses over here and a lot of surface area. And the Ukrainian garrison is not that small. I mean, it's been stripped of a lot of its forces because other locations were far more in need, and it was far more crucial for them. But even here, you still have a tiny group of forces. 113th TDF, you have 4 Prus Brigade, which is the National Guard units. You have VDAR Special Forces units. You have the 9th Rifle Battalion, 57th Motorized Brigade, 58th Motorized Brigade, 72nd Mechanized Brigade has moved in, but I don't know how effective they are now after, the crisis in Vuhledar and the fact that they were defending near the border with Dnipro. So they were given rest, and now they've been sent here to fill in the gaps. But clearly, it's not been enough. And then 101st Brigade for the protection of general staff. And again, the Russians are advancing over here, even though they moved forces away. They moved forces from 69th and 72nd Motor Rifle Divisions and from the 11th and 41st, I think, Army Corps. They moved some of those forces away. They moved them to this sort of bridgehead past the border, where you have the 83rd Motor Rifle Regiment, 7th, and the 79th. So those forces are involved in the operation from Milovets or Dradny, and they were previously a part of the northern group of forces in Vovchansk. But even though they were moved away, the Russian forces that were actually engaged over here on the ground, like 136th MRB, 82nd Regiment, 1009th Regiment, and then 41st Regiment, all also with the help of the 138th Brigade, those forces, and it's only 5 units in particular, they've just been leading the way and continuing to advance regardless at paces that have hitherto not been seen really since, I suppose, the beginning of the offensive in its entirety. So that's just a consequence of forces being redirected from one place to another. So the Russians just repeating their strategy of creating pockets, then trying to pin down as many forces as possible, concentrate them in tightly packed areas in order to attrit them, and then intrigue the supply lines, and then advance through the weak points. That's been the story of a lot of these cauldrons that are now beginning to close, most notably Pokrovsk, and we'll talk about it in far more detail when I have the time. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.